Very excited here, Vancouver Overcast, the first episode of 2020. I have two fantastic guests, Amir from This Is VANCOLOUR podcast, Joseph Planta from TheCommentary.ca podcast. We're going to talk about podcasting and a whole lot else. So thanks very much. You know this is the podcast where we talk to city leaders and innovators, and stay tuned because we're going to have a great chat. Okay, so there's my new type of opening. Thank you, Joe, for the suggestion. We'll see how that goes. At any rate, welcome to Vancouver Overcast. Really excited to have you both on for a variety of reasons. I've been listening to you for Joe, for you for a very long time. Mo, really in the last several months as I started to become more aware of This Is VANCOLOUR. I wanted to maybe just start with a really basic question. Why podcasting, and why did this become what you decided that you're going to invest a bunch of your time in? Jim Mo?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, first of all, I just want to say thanks for having me on. It's a highbrow program. I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but
I wonder the same for myself,
But I am grateful and I'm happy to be here. So thanks for having me on. In terms of why I started, just for fun. I'm a fan of podcasts. I'm a fan of long form interviews. I just thought this would be a great little project and just see where it goes. Don't have any expectations or outcomes, and roll with it. So it's been a trip so far.
Your This Is VANCOLOUR. You've been talking to quite a number of politicians. It seems that you are a student of politics without being political, I would sort of say. I mean, you sort of sometimes throw your opinions out there and kick off conversations, but what's your interest in our elected officials and your ability to get them to tell their stories?
I'm a politics junkie. I mean, my master's degree is in political science, which I don't really put to good use, I guess, except for the podcast.
There you go.
My interest is, people ask me, what's my political ideology? And I honestly find that as I get older, it's cynical. But that said, I do like meeting politicians and politicians that resonate with me. I love conversating with them, and that's just an interest of mine.
Yeah, that's a funny thing about politics, I think, is the longer you think about it, the less political you might be. I mean, there's certain issues that you might get political about, like the environment or trade or electoral reform or something like that. But I find the longer that I'm doing this, my opinion doesn't really matter anymore. I think that, it's probably more informed from the variety of things I've read or the people that I've talked with. But I don't think that I'm just like everybody else. I voted for pretty much every party in the last, 10 years.
And of course, you are known now because of your fantastic button collection. Not that would be the only thing that'll be on your grave marker or something.
The only reason I came here today was because Mike very kindly.
He brought no buttons.
No, I didn't. But he gave me some buttons around Christmas, and so I'm repaying the favor.
So I was going through my drawer because I have a lot of little bags and knickknacks. I found some more buttons. I found a Kim Campbell button from 1993 campaign. So that might be something you're walking away with.
Well, I was looking for a Mike Klassen button when you ran for office.
I think I might have one of those. Did I not give you one? I didn't know. Okay, I wasn't sure if you actually wanted one of those. But since we're on the subject of podcasts, who are some of the ones that you like to listen to, and what how do they influence what you do? Do you think?
I listen to Pop This with Lisa Christensen and Andrea Warner. I just enjoy both of them and their opinions. In terms of podcasts, I listen to Mo. I'll go, I don't know, several weeks and then binge him. Because when you're in the middle of making your own podcast, you have little time to actually listen to other people. And I pretty much listen to podcasts. I've gone blank now, but. There are a few that Nick Thornton and his podcast, People Doing Things. It's now called something else. Now I enjoy him. He's from Vancouver, and I think he's really innovated sort of the format, if you will, of what podcasts.
How so?
Well, he had one podcast called Stranger Than Friend, where he decided to find someone online through a dating site and get to know them. And they got to know each other through podcasting.
Wow.
And I mean, I would never have thought of that in a million years to do that. And I think it's a wonderful way to get to know someone, especially someone who's far away. And that's a sort of innovation that I think podcasting needs to, I think it demands. I mean, everyone has a crime podcast nowadays. Everyone has an interview podcast. You know, I've been doing it for 16 years, and I'm getting tired of that format. I'm not looking to move on to a different format, but I think that, you know, it gets tiring after a while. You'll find this, Mo, and you'll find this, Mike, that you're looking for something new to do after a while.
You've done like 18,000 episodes or something.
1,800, I think. Yeah, 1,800, yeah.
When did you start? And by the way, I was going to ask Mo, are you seeing romance breaking out all over the place with podcasters? You were at the Vancouver Podcasters conference, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking about a relationship that formed between podcasters. Is that what you were sort of saying earlier on?
No. With Nick, it was he found someone on a dating site just to meet someone to talk with.
Oh, okay.
And so they ended up podcasting for a year and a half. I went to the podcast festival the year before Mo did, and the fandom isn't the right word, but the reliance that a lot of people have on podcasts is frightening in a way. I mean, you know, that's where most millennials, if you will, I shouldn't say most millennials, but a lot of millennials that we encounter, that's how they get their news, rather than say, you know, the way that we got our news growing up.
Wow.
Well, you just look at the success of, I know you're a big fan of Joe Rogan. I mean,
Yeah.
The devotees to that, I mean,
yeah, Joe Rogan does like 100 million downloads every month. I don't think there's any medium or program that kind of posts the numbers that he gets, right? So his influence is definitely there in the cultural psyche. With regard to your first question about romance popping up between podcasters, I've had this question. People have asked me like, oh, you know, you do these spots on CKNW, you get to talk to all these local celebrities, you know, like there must be girls DMing you and all that stuff. No, never. I don't know why. It's always dudes DMing me, and not for romance. It's just dudes that want to like bro out. And I think some of them want to be on the podcast. It's a lot of fitness people and a lot of financial advisors that I guess listen to me and think that we're on, we have the same wavelength, and they want to chat. So I get a lot of that, but no romance.
Okay, so for Vancouver Overcast listeners, there's your takeaway. Ladies, DM Mo if you can.
Please.
but that does say something. I mean, I brought up Joe Rogan a moment ago, and then now we're talking about the people that are messaging Mo. There's this idea of, I guess, the bro element, males in general, who want to reach out, want to talk, and they would not have had that ability before podcasting, I would think.
Yeah, you create communities through a podcast. It's interesting, the communities that I've created on Twitter with the podcasting. Like there's the sort of housing community, and I know the housing conversation on Twitter can be very toxic and negative, but I feel like I have people that I chat with on both sides of the debate, and you do create these new communities through podcasting. I think that's actually why my Twitter, out of all my social media channels, has taken off the most, because it is like a conversational channel as opposed to Instagram or Facebook.
It seems like that there's no shortage of desire to talk about the housing issue.
Yeah, can we not talk about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Okay.
That'd be fun.
All right. I'm good with that. It is interesting, though, that a lot of the interviews that you have done, for example, recently with Tom Davidoff, you've talked to mayors and other elected officials about that issue. Do you come away from any of these interviews feeling like you've really learned something, or you still kind of feel like it's frustrating you to kind of know how to kind of address these things?
I think it's one of those things where the more you learn about something, the more you realize you don't know anything. So I will walk away from episodes learning quite a bit. And it's not just learning in the interview itself, but it's the prep for the interview that I learned quite a bit. And then within the interview, and then also sometimes the feedback that I get from people either on Twitter or through direct messages about the interview. So it is this learning process about a subject in a lot of ways. And it's cool. That's kind of why I enjoy it.
Yeah, I've ceased interviewing politicians or candidates. I used to do that all the time in this riding. Every candidate, provincially, federally, as many municipal candidates as I could find. I'd invite them on and we'd chat.
Well, Don Davies is practically your neighbor, right?
He lives across the street, yeah. But I mean, I haven't had Don on in years. I find I like interviewing retired politicians or politicians in between gigs because they're probably more reflective and they're not on script, if you will. And I think that's why I've just not wanted to do that anymore and talk to the people that Mo talks to, say, for example.
Well, you spend a lot of time interviewing a lot of authors.
Yeah,
and
journalists too. I mean, active journalists is much more edifying than I think politicians.
I was listening to your interview with Bill Richardson yesterday, and Bill, of course, a longtime broadcaster, great wit, self-deprecating, and
great voice too.
An amazing voice. And I remember Bill when he was originally kind of a protege of Vicky Gabourou.
Yeah, that's right.
And went on to be running national programs for CBC. And then we get to a point where he's talking about his life and talking about where he wants to be buried. And he was very, kind of sardonic about all of that. And then he talked about his new gig as a dishwasher.
Yeah.
Just can you describe a little bit of what you heard when he was, because it was a very interesting way that he...
Yeah, it was fascinating. About a year or so ago on the Sunday edition, he had an essay. And he has essays from time to time about Christmas and the sort. He sort of, and as he describes us in the chat that we did, he's sort of coming out as a dishwasher. That he was depressed because his dog had died and there was no reason for him to leave his apartment. And he's, I think, a bit of a neat freak. And so he cleaned his apartment and there was no reason to leave. So he decided to get a job as a dishwasher. It would get him out of the house. It would get him cleaning. And that's what he's been doing. Part of the time, filling his time. I mean, it also provides him an income. He had a writer-in-residence gig at the University of Manitoba recently. So he's, but this week he was working as a dishwasher during dine out, which I would think is probably one of the worst.
It was where he talked about, I just worked last night. I worked till 1 o'clock in the morning. I was exhausted.
Yeah.
And I suppose all of us think about, where are we going to go and where does all this go? And, when someday when Mo is the superstar that he once will become,
You were being too nice.
But it brings it all home in a way, right? When you hear Bill's story of becoming this incredible, public figure, and then in his sort of isolation there, decides he just needs to reconnect with the world, and he's going to do it in what is probably perceived as one of the more menial jobs that one can have, right? The joke is that, you could do the dishes if you couldn't pay for your dinner, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And yet he finds that, it's a tough job, obviously. And he as he says in the interview, he's 64 and it's physically taxing. But, I didn't get a sense. I sort of tried to get him to answer the question as whether he'd rather be in front of a microphone than in front of a sink. But, he didn't offer
an answer to that.
Yeah, like whether he would or not.
Yeah,
which is someone who's a big star like that across the country, not just in this town. I wondered about that, whether he would miss it, and he seems to be at peace with it, which is really surprising.
I was telling Mo when he came in today, because we met each other for the first time today in person, and I talked about being in high school, high school broadcasting clubs, eventually college radio over at CITR and what have you. And then I worked in professional radio for a short time as well, usually kind of behind the scenes, but on air and on mic a bunch of times as well. And it's a medium that I've always really cherished and always get so mad at when it's not as good as it can be.
I think it's one that we all love, I think.
Yeah.
It's the three of us sitting here. Otherwise, why would we do it, right?
I became, when I was a young guy in my 20s, I guess, and maybe even before that, probably in high school, I had my radio heroes. I remember the sound of FM radio when it was really kind of taking off in the late 70s, And at that time, they're playing Elvis Costello for the very first time. They go, "What's this?" And I remember Ellie O'Day, who has this beautiful voice for such a tiny woman. And Ellie is now living at the PAL Vancouver, and I'm involved in the board there. And so I've got to know Ellie. She's become a good friend of mine. And I kind of always acknowledge the fact that she was one of my radio heroes at the time.
One of the first female DJs in this town, too, wasn't she?
In fact, I always say, you were the person who broke Dire Straits in Vancouver. It was true. She was the first one spinning Sultans of Swing, and I think she was really into it. And I remember at one point, not long after that radio sort of stardom, she was working in a record store. Right. Mm-hmm. And she's a very happy person, and she does, she's basically retired now, but has been doing publicity over the years. But radio is a very fickle business, as you know. And
it's an awful business. And I think that's one of the reasons why I started this 16 years ago thinking that I'd parlay this into, doing something in radio.
Sure.
Then you're quickly disabused by that idea when you realize just what a terrible business it is to work. I mean, you appear on a station where a host recently tweeted that the wage that was paid for a producer at one point, not too long ago, was something like $17 an hour.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would think that if your parents would probably not want you to get into this.
Yeah. It's a beast of an industry. I mean, the more media people I meet, and this goes for journalists as well, it just seems like such a grind, right? And they really do love what they're doing, and that's why they're doing it, because they could easily go work in communications for some big company or do something else. But you see so many of these media personalities who I think are household local names hustling, and just, you see them on TV or radio and you're like, oh my God, you've made it big, you're huge, but they're just out there grinding. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. And I certainly had no idea. I thought if you were spinning records, at one of the big top 40 stations, you were making bank, but
no,
but that is not true.
Well, I mean, Mikey, we've got like at least 2 news anchors living within, a 1 kilometer radius from where we're sitting.
Is one of them initials DB?
Yes.
Okay.
But I mean, 20 years ago, you would not have thought that, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have thought that Tony Parsons would live in a neighborhood like, where we're living, or would be close to where we're living. And so it brings it back that these people are actually just people. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I think we forget that because we see them on TV or we hear them on radio or read them in the newspaper, that they're just like, just like you and me.
I was mentioning having my radio heroes, and one of the people that was in that category, and I became quite good friends with him, is JB Shane. So JB, Johan Bruno, Captain Midnight, he had probably about 40 different handles that he had been a 1960s era CKVN, C-Fun DJ, along with Terry David Mulligan and Roy Henderson, a bunch of these guys, names you're not going to know. But these were people that really were super influential in that medium. And then and then JB and I got to work together at Coast 1040 and recorded a bunch of crazy stuff. And I convinced him to come and do some video stuff that I did with Rogers Cable, which is a community office, and we had fun. We produced a half-hour show called Festivision 2, which was a lot of fun, and it was a real great way for him to show, what he was capable of. And he'd already done so amazing things in the early days of pay TV, Super Channel. Right. He had a show called Night Vision. He used to be the late night kind of guy spinning the Lou Reed and in the Elvis Costello records in CBC with Neon Nights. JB is in many ways reminds me of Bill Story. He's a guy who retired from society in some ways, and because he did not, as much as he'd love to be in front of the microphone. In fact, I have a plan now. I'm going to try and coax JB and John Tanner, Long John, to come here and talk with me about those days.
So too tall for the space.
I know. I have to watch, sadly. But it feels like podcasting is a way for us to kind of take away the, I mean,
Yeah.
obviously you're not broadcasting at 50,000 watts and, for 250,000 people at a time, but you're still out there, having a voice, kind of putting your ideas forward and getting in front of the mic.
I've always found it. I like having journalists on.
Yeah.
And I like having them come in a format that's different than what they're used to, and break down the stories of the day or how they do their job. Because as a viewer, as a reader, as a listener, I'd like a little more context about how it all works. And I think that's what podcasting can do.
Yeah,
And
I would extend that to every sort of profession or guest. I think in that long format, depending on the method and the strategy that you employ in your interview, you get so much more texture to someone's personality by talking to them for an hour as opposed to a 10-minute radio hit or a 3-minute TV clip, right?
Or an interview that's interrupted by commercials.
Sure, yeah.
And I think conversations are better when they're not interrupted by anything. And I think that's what podcasting is probably, that's what it's done, I think. And that's why, not unfortunately, but all the CBC, they're in the podcast game now, and Chorus.
They have to be.
Yeah, and the sort of independent podcast, if you will. I don't know if that'll be around 5-10 years from now.
I think it still will be. I mean, there's such a low barrier to entry, and something blowing up is so hard to predict, right? It's hard to predict what's going to be popular or what podcast is going to take off there. And finding your niche becomes very important. There's some people who love podcasts where it's the same two hosts just chatting, and somehow they're super popular. And there'll often be podcasts that I'll listen to, and I'll see, oh, this is a very popular podcast, and I just don't get it. Long form interviews, I can kind of see, oh yeah, I can see why this is popular. But there's other formats where I'm just like, I don't see the appeal, but great. There's also videos on YouTube of kids playing video games that have like 10 million views. And I don't understand that. Right?
My daughter watches those ones too, and
yeah, I don't get it, but it's resonating with people. So great, good for those people.
Mo, you're about 60. How many episodes in? 70 yet?
Episode 63 on January 27th, whenever you're listening to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
And was there a point, you must have gone in as a leap of faith and saying, I'm going to try this out. I'm sure you probably had all the ambitions of being perhaps the next Joe Rogan or something, but
no.
But was there a point during that 63 episode odyssey that became, aha, now I know why I'm doing this? Was there that at that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I point to episode 30, which is a lot deeper than I'd like to admit. There were some real good gems before that. There was an episode with Karen Kunkun from CFOX. There was an episode with Dr. Mark Tyndall that I really enjoyed. And there were a few episodes on the way to that where I was just like, oh, I can't believe I just had that interview or made this podcast. But then episode 30, the very first one with Brad West, I think that was a turning point for me. And I really hit my stride, and I feel like I haven't looked back since. And that's also when things did, I don't want to say blowing up, but opportunities started opening up for me, and higher profile guests started coming on, and I started to get some media hits. And I think that was the episode. And I say that in the second episode with Brad West, which is episode 60. And I tell him, I think that was the one that put me on the map.
So I listened to that just this week.
2-hour bombshell, right? Oh my God. Who's doing that in this city? No one.
Well, the reason was I actually had to go to a meeting out in the Fraser Valley, and with gridlock coming back during rush hour, I had plenty of time to listen to you and Brad. And I thought it was really interesting, as obviously you guys have clicked. I think he has a real gift. I mean, first of all, he kind of has in some ways he has the young good looks of a public figure.
He's a good looking man, sure.
But and by the way, when I was doing City Caucus over a decade ago, Daniel had this idea that we were going to do. I think it was a kind of a bike to work thing. Get your politicians to bike to work week kind of thing, or something like that. And so so he reached out. We had Jonathan Cote, who was a city councilor at the time.
Okay, cool.
And then we had Brad West, who
Oh,
was one of
okay.
our kind of guest bloggers. So I
Yeah.
still, you know, and it was funny because when Daniel was running for city council in New Westminster, they were using City Caucus against him. And I said, well, Jonathan Cote was one of our bloggers.
Yeah.
Right?
So what you're saying is you and Brad were bros before me and Brad were bros.
Perhaps, you know, and but it's interesting to me. At the same time, with all of that talent, he also is a very talented politician, and I use that in the concept of he does have a way of answering the questions in a way that he wants you to hear. And I remember specifically you asking him a question about an hour and change into the 2-hour Odyssey about his, because it had been reported, I think, in the Tri-City News about his other occupation.
With the steelworkers.
And I noticed how he answered that question. I'm not sure, did you notice how he answered that question? He answered it in a way that he didn't talk about whether he was still doing that job.
You're right, but he was talking in the present tense in terms of I'm proud to be a steelworker. So I think it was implied in that. But yeah, perhaps that's a good observation. I think he did spin it in a way in terms of how media narratives are framed, and I thought it was a very good answer, to be honest.
It was a good answer. It was a skillful answer.
Sure. Yeah.
I also was kind of quite captivated that he spent at least the first half hour. I mean, you guys talked a lot about the China factor, I guess, and but he spent a lot of his time really kind of dressing down people from the political class, which I thought was kind of a classic populist thing to do, right? And I mean, he's done it all over Twitter, so we're not. But to hear it in his words in that way, and he was just so resolute on it. And I'm sure he makes a lot of people very uncomfortable, and in that context, whether it's at UBCM or you know,
and that's what I love, and I think the culture of politics is shifting, and I think the culture of media is shifting too, in this frame of populism versus elitism. And populism gets a bad rap because it's always associated with Trump, but I don't think that's true populism. I think, as we sort of talked about at the start here, people are resonating with politicians that they trust. It becomes less about ideology and hard principles, and it becomes about don't BS me, just do what you're going to say, and if I can trust you to do the job and speak the truth, then you have my support. And I think we're shifting towards that on the political end. I think we're seeing a little bit of that with Bernie Sanders as well. I think we're going to see more of that in Canada, and also in media. I think the idea of like a well-polished, groomed interviewer or broadcaster, I think that's going out the window too. I think people want authenticity. They want more texture to the people that they are inviting into their lives through media and listening to all the time. And I think that's Rogan's success in a lot of ways. And I think more so we're seeing the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to be authentic, really starting to resonate with people. And when someone is too polished, it kind of gives you the heebie-jeebies now, right? No one likes no one likes the slick salesman anymore.
Well,
which is good.
The measurement that a lot of people use in politics is, would I like to have a beer with that person, right?
Yeah.
And so that means that, I can sit beside them and they're not going to just be lying to my face. We're going to be bros, whatever. We're going to be able, if we're going to have a good conversation. Is that what is going to form the foundation of political success? Provincially here, potentially with the Green Party looking for leaders, both federally and provincially. What kind of things are you going to be looking for in the leaders going forward? And does that even exist today? Does John Horgan represent that? Do other? Because I'm thinking to what Maxime Bernier did, because he went for, I guess you could call it it was a populist movement. It was, we're going to double down on immigration and we're going to come and he looked to do quite a faceplant. I mean, from not getting elected, barely getting any vote.
It was a meme campaign, though, I think.
Yeah.
It was more if the message that he was giving had a nifty slogan. That's what you would see on Facebook or Twitter. That's what people would post. And so if your feed was clogged up with that, you would think, yeah, maybe Bernier is onto something, and yeah, maybe it's dangerous. But then at the end of the day, you look at, how much support that party got across the country.
Yeah.
And so that's why I tend to worry that Twitter and social media is not really a good barometer of what's really happening.
He was working off the Trumpian template, and it didn't resonate here. And we can spend hours dissecting why that's so. I don't think it was necessarily true. I think it was a divisive campaign. I don't know how much it was reaching out to different communities. The idea of populism is, it's rooted in the left, and it's about a backlash against structures of power and concentrations of power. Was Bernier the right guy for that? I don't really think so. Trump technically is not the right guy, but somehow it worked in the U.S. And we can talk for hours about why that happened. So I don't see populism as a negative term, or I don't see it as, racist or xenophobic or anything like that. I just think it means connecting people together.
I'm quick to sort of say that you may not like the people who are the leaders, the Trumps perhaps, but I'm very cautious about attacking the people that do support them.
No, I agree. Yeah.
I remember wincing when I heard Hillary Clinton's deplorables comment, which she just kind of threw it out.
And she fed into the elitism label by doing that, right? And so when we look at populism versus elitism, all of this is media framing, and she played that very poorly, whereas I think he did a good job. And he traveled so much throughout the
Rust Belt.
Throughout the Rust Belt, and pretending that he was going to be this champion of the people.
But it speaks to the idea that there's a need out there, something that the public wants from its elected officials right now that they're not finding, and so you can't blame them for wanting to have some things change. It's just that it's finding the right mix of leadership and responsibility, I guess, in that person you vote for.
Don't you get that in spiritual voids as well? People who are looking for something more meaningful.
Sure, yeah.
You have some great religions and organizations that will help fill that, but then you have a lot of hucksters as well, right? Who are going to rip you off. And it's the same thing in politics.
Can I ask you, you did mention the Brad West being sort of, but what were a couple of occasions or interviews where you were quite surprised by somebody, what they said during your interviews?
Yeah, if we're going to stick to the politicians, Andrew Wilkinson came in with a lot of fire, and I was very surprised. I was overjoyed, because as soon as he started talking, I thought that was amazing. Yeah. But that definitely surprised me. I wasn't sure what to expect. I think I expected like an even-toned interview, and he just came in with a lot of passion and a lot of fire, which meant, effectively dissing every single member of the BC NDP effectively, right? Mm-hmm. And that was one that definitely surprised me.
Did any of it resonate with you? I mean, in terms of maybe not necessarily agreeing, but you thought that the arguments were well made. I haven't listened to that interview yet. Or did you feel like it was a lot of really strong views, but the argument still wasn't there? And the reason I ask that is because obviously Andrew Wilkinson is going to have to meet with the voters at some point, whether it's later this year or next year.
I think if he sustains that type of tone, the effect is going to be mobilizing the BC Liberal base, kind of getting them energized, his built-in supporters. Sure. But I don't know if he's going to convert any hardcore NDP people over. So it was a bit of a Rorschach test. If you were an NDPer, you hated the guy more. If you were a BC Liberal, you liked the guy a lot more. And that's, I think, the effect that it had.
But the Wilkinson that was on your show, is that the Wilkinson that we see, say, in the House, or we see on the evening news?
Maybe not on the evening news, but when you hear him first of all, I think the decorum of the House is brutal. I think they need to grow up, all of them, not just the BC Liberals, everyone. The banging on the table and the yelling and
I wouldn't
the booing.
mind all of that if it was if you had as much entertainment value as you do in the British House of Commons, right?
Or a speaker with a personality like Burko was, right?
I mean, I can't believe I'm the one that's saying this. I just think it's unbecoming of our elected officials, and I understand that there's a tradition to that theater, but I just don't like it. I don't think it resonates with people. It's weird. So he definitely plays up that. I feel like he plays up that guy there, but I've heard him on CKNW, and he comes in with fire as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So,
but that hasn't resonated in terms of a rise in the support of that party. I don't think
they only need a little bit of a rise in support to form government. I mean, let's be honest. They did win the most seats.
Yeah.
They just have to flip a couple, and Maple Ridge is pretty vulnerable. There are a lot of vulnerable spots where they just have to flip a few, and that's all they need. They don't need a widespread victory.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the accepted wisdom out there is that, generally speaking, governments don't tend to lose more seats the second time around. They tend to, gain more seats. They tend to lose a few.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that'll be the case because Horgan's really is sort of been steadfastly popular.
Yeah, he's more popular today than I think he was on election day.
I know.
Yeah, I think so.
And
he plays up that dad image really well.
Yeah.
He just seems like, again, a cool guy.
I've met him a bunch of times. He's always quite charming and self-effacing and again, somebody who you probably want to have a beer with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mo, you tweeted about BC Polytalk, and you talked about the essential, basically, two old white straight guys who are lobbyists. Pick your adjectives. I thought it was a very interesting comment, and I like how you kind of circled back on it and what you were. But describe kind of what happened there, and then describe a little bit about what your concern is and potentially where we go with it.
Oh, that is a loaded question, Mike. Where do I start with this?
Welcome to Vancouver Overcast.
Yeah, thank you. Planta, you can take a 5. I'm gonna rant for a bit. No, so there was a new show. It's a web show called BC Polytalk, hosted by one of your friends, Daniel Fontaine, and Bill Tillman. And I just came across my Facebook feed or my Twitter feed, and I was like, "Oh, this is interesting." And they had some promo videos up, and then I was looking at it, and they kept promoting it as filling the void of what's missing in the discourse in British Columbia, which I thought was very interesting. And it just seemed to reek of self-awareness that, as I said, there was 5 traits that they had, which I feel represented in an overrepresented political, cultural echo chamber in political discourse. So I tweeted about it, and I made a joke, and a lot of people found it pretty funny. A lot of media people, a lot of political people found it really funny. They liked or tweeted it on Twitter. I had more than a dozen people privately DM me. They didn't want to show that they were publicly laughing, but they privately DM me, so it resonated with people. And I think a few people got mad because they said, "Oh, I pointed out that they were white or boomers or whatever."
Identity politics, somebody said.
Yeah, a few people were saying that I was playing up to identity politics, but I was just, it wasn't even a criticism of them specifically. It was a criticism of again, like I said, the culture of having this overrepresented political cultural echo chamber discussing politics. I don't think it was anything groundbreaking. And to be honest, I did them a favor. I mean, in terms of, no, I did. In terms of Twitter engagement, I put more eyeballs on their Twitter feed than Bill Tillman had been doing in trying to promote this thing. So, and to be honest, I think that I changed the culture of their show. They trotted out Ravi Kalon in the 2nd episode. Jazz Johal is going to come out on the 3rd episode. And I'm going to take full credit for that. The fact that you asked me about that tweet, the fact that you think that that's so important that you need to ask me, proves that it had an impact and that it's interesting. So,
and I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, I just don't think that both Daniel and Bill, who I have, I've had Bill on the show. I've never had Daniel on the show. I don't think they lacked for a platform, and the fact that it was trotted out as something that was filling a void, if you will.
Yeah.
I think was disingenuous, to say the least.
It's insulting. It's not insulting to me. It's insulting to actual journalists and broadcasters that are filling that void. I don't think there was an empty void to fill. And this idea, and I don't mind saying it, they're both active lobbyists. This idea that these two lobbyists are going to real talk with politicians, but then the next day have to go to them and ask them for favors is bullshit. I'm sorry, I don't know if you're allowed to swear on your show, but it absolutely is. And it was really funny because the majority of first of all, most of the feedback was very positive. There was a minority of feedback that was negative on it. And a lot of that was like anonymous bot accounts that don't have the courage to put their name.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah. Then there was one person who was a person of color who RT quoted me. And they said that I was being divisive and it was middle of the run commentary or whatever. So I looked this person up and they were a lobbyist at Burrard Strategy. And I found that really interesting because Mark Marison, who is the principal at BS, he's a big fan of the show. He wants to come on the show. He's always sending me messages about how great the show is. So I just found that weird. And again, it was a lobbyist that really was upset at that.
Yeah, I don't know if in knowing Mark, I don't know if he would have had a direct hand in it. I think he basically has surrounded himself with a lot of political animals like himself. And then the nature of politics is it just does that to you, man. Like you just get so kind of fired up, and sometimes you just have to put down the Twitter for a little bit because you're going to get emotional about something that doesn't make sense. Put the context of it in all together, and you realize that you got a couple of guys who've been around, political hacks, and I'm sure they would both describe themselves as being just that, who've bring that political kind of mojo to what they were doing. And so we'll see how it goes. I mean, it's interesting kind of the conversations that I watched the Ravi Kalin one. I thought Ravi came across as such a charming guy. I always knew he was because I've met him a bunch of times. But he was terrific in that context. To be fair, I would sort of add in the only proviso is that a lot of the people who do comment about particularly British Columbia politics tend to come from sort of the media classes. And so they've been in the kind of journalism side of things. And the reason I'm a huge fan of the Hurley Burley podcast now, which is David Hurley and Scott Reed and Jenny Byrne, is they've been in the war room. They've been involved in campaigns. They know what it's like to deal with candidates. They think about this stuff as, it's like eating breakfast for them. And I'm hoping that we get a little bit of that. And I know Daniel very well. I've worked with him very closely. And I know Bill well as well. And the two of them are pretty good in their own subtle way at sort of bringing what they think are the political pieces that have to be moved around the chessboard. So we'll see if that happens.
Totally. And again, I want to emphasize, it was not a personal knock on either of them. It was a critique of the culture, which I thought was very funny. But I think what that tweet also, what I wanted it to represent is the fact that there is a frustration with how politics and governance is framed in the media. You can look at, Power and Politics on CBC. They have a lot of lobbyists, active lobbyists on their show.
Oh, for sure.
And so the way that things are framed in the media are not the conversations that people are having around the dinner table. I think a lot of that stuff, when you have active political insiders framing how issues the way they want to frame them and talking about things the way that they want to do that's all kabuki theater. That is not reflective of the conversations that real people are having. And that's my problem with it. And I think people are seeing through it. And again, it goes back to the idea that I threw out earlier, which is both in politics and I think in media, there is this growing divide between populism and elitism. And people see that type of media as elitism that doesn't speak to them. And to be honest, I think they're on the wrong format. I don't think YouTube is a great format for them. I think it's going to be a waste. YouTube is mostly young people that are on it.
Yeah, they do
playing video games.
Yeah, watching other young people.
They have an audio podcast.
They do, yeah.
And that's where I'm kind of going because I have my YouTube obsession for a whole bunch of other things.
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
On the same topic, and we can drop it after this question. Is it fair that Bill Thielman has media accreditation to certain government things, although he is a lobbyist? Because I know from certain journalists who, again, through this affair, told me that they don't like that. They're very upset by it. The fact that he has media accreditation while being a lobbyist, while pretending to be a broadcaster or analyst or pundit or whatever it is Is that fair?
I suppose it depends on what hat he's wearing. If it has to do with things that are directly related to his work, because I remember he was, of course, I think he writes for the Tyee occasionally. He used to have his 24 Hours column. That probably gave him different access at different times. I know that he also, like me, is kind of a part-time wine blogger, so he likes to kind of get into events that are wine-related. So I don't know. I think it's a good question. Maybe Bill can answer that, and maybe if I ever get
Bill
him
on
on
your show,
I'll
Mo.
get him on. Get Bill on the show.
I don't know if he's the right demo for my show, to be honest with you.
Well, you've had some very interesting, people from, and if I was talking to Bill, I'd love to get into the time machine with him because he's been around in politics for 30 years, and he probably
He's
tells
had a great career, absolutely.
Speaking of dinner table conversation, you reminded me just how over the holidays this year I got to have those family conversations, and once the wine gets flowing, we ended up having some really interesting kind of down to earth conversations about what things that we were frustrated by. I've got relatives, so they're all over the political map. What kind of conversations have you guys been hearing, and do you have those conversations, Joe? Do you have those around the Planta table?
I tend to as Mo said a moment ago, the conversations that one has with people that you have coffee with or lunch with or dinner with in a family situation or otherwise are different than the ones that we're seeing on Twitter.
Oh,
and that's why the election results are different, you know what I mean, than what we would, say, expect on Twitter the day of an election as opposed to the night of. I think a lot of people are worried. And I think a lot of people are concerned about where we're headed because we don't really know how this story ends. And we might have had a better idea, say, 20, 30 years ago as opposed to
Do you think
today.
so?
I think so. I mean, you hear about the environment and the climate, whatever they call it today, the emergency or the and then you look at, a lack of leadership politically in this country or in the United States on everything from, what to do with Iran or...
Yeah, I think when it comes to globalization and just the advancement of technology, our lives are more complicated. I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. We just have also more people in our city, in our country, in our world to make things complicated. What I find interesting is I think most people, at least the people that I'm in contact with and in friends with outside of the podcast realm, they're either completely cynical and think everyone is corrupt or they are checked out. They don't care. And some of my friends, I wouldn't say they've re-engaged in politics, but thankfully, because they're so supportive, they will listen to my podcast and they will listen to a Brad West episode and say, you know what, I really liked him. Or they'll listen to a David Eby episode, not knowing anything about David Eby, right? There's people in their 30s in this city that don't know who David Eby is. And they'll say, you know what, that was really interesting. Like I could follow along. He sounded like an honest guy. And so I think those people need to be re-engaged and those people need to be mobilized that's what political parties should be thinking. Because there are a lot of millennials who just don't care and they just think everyone's the same and everyone's just out for, their own profit.
I've made a habit of using the word optimist whenever I put a profile for Facebook or for Twitter or Instagram. So I always have the word, I consider myself to be an optimist. And it's because I don't want to be ever, as much as I'm as terrified of the thought of, look at what's happening with the coronavirus this week right now. Look at that, and that's some pretty scary things going on out there. I tend to err on the side that somebody is going to help us, and I think it requires all of us to have some involvement in that as well.
Yeah.
Which is why I serve as on volunteer boards. I do community work. I try to think that everybody needs to kind of put their hands in, and so disengaging is probably the biggest worry that I have, is that we're going to create that kind of political cynicism that you're talking about. And maybe in a very small way, these kinds of conversations distributed through, people's, earbuds are going to be able to have people kind of ask themselves, how can I get more engaged? And it might be politically or in other ways.
Or just awareness.
Yeah.
What's happening in my community, what's happening in my province. And, maybe the way things are being communicated through certain outlets, they find it boring, but maybe through podcasting or through non-traditional outlets, they are finding themselves become interested in those things.
I mean, just the traditional media, which we talked about when we started the conversation, the numbers that we grew up with, they're not there anymore. I think that
reflects disengagement.
Yeah, and so where are people getting their news? I think, or how are they getting engaged? Is another thing to think about.
That's why all the Democratic presidential candidates want to be on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's had Bernie, Tulsi, and Andrew Yang, and he said on his own podcast that Biden, Warren, they've all asked to come on because they know the power of that, and they know that he taps into a population that is disengaged and can be very powerful in a primary election or in a general election.
Joe, I think you told me you've been doing TheCommentary.ca since 2003?
That's right, yeah, 16 years, yeah.
Yeah. When you got it started, were you trying to, what about yourself and your upbringing, you grew up in did you go to Tupper High?
Yeah, I went to Tupper.
So you're kind of,
this neighborhood, yeah.
From your either your heritage or from what kind of things about yourself did you want to be reflected in that work?
I really didn't think about that. I mean, I wanted to ask questions like Rafe Mayer, or Tim Russert, or interview authors like Don Imus. And so that identity is obviously not mine. My parents are Filipino. I was born here. I never felt really Filipino. I mean, I think that's what people see when they meet you. I mean, I get this all the time. People, who I've interviewed over the years, surprised, I'm this age or this ethnicity. So I don't think I really wore that on my sleeve, but I think it is worth thinking about whether the media is reflective of the society that it serves.
The Filipino community has been so strong and has become so well established here. Have you had a chance to speak with any of its leaders? And are we seeing? I mean, I having been on more than a few campaigns, I know there was always a few go-to organizers and people who could usually bring out the vote or get engagement with candidates.
I remember that election in this riding. I can't remember. It was 2 elections ago. Mabel Elmore was running for. Yeah. And the candidate for the Liberal Party was also Filipino. I mean, that was fascinating to think that, the 2 major parties in this riding.
And the Filipino festival went down Fraser Street
That's
that
right,
one
yeah.
year. I remember they shut down Fraser. It's actually kind of cool. I could hear all the banging. And
So I have talked, like most communities, like all communities, really. I mean, it is not a monolith. It is not, it's not. You have people that don't like each other or can't stand each other, and so they have different factions, different groups, and the sort. But again, maybe that's also reflective of how engaged a group of people are on certain issues or in the discourse itself.
Mo, tell us about you and your kind of North Vancouver upbringing, and because I haven't heard that part of it, and I'm not sure if I went to your website and didn't see, like, there wasn't a great big long bio. Some people like to talk a little bit about themselves, and maybe that's deliberate, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about your.
Yeah, because effectively, I mean, the podcast is not about me; it's about the guests that I bring on, and I guess it's about my interest in them, but it's not about me as a person. I've lived a very charmed life in North Vancouver. I had amazing parents. Upper middle class, whatever you want to call it. And that's why I kind of embrace the identity of a basic bro, because I'm into, things like yoga and kombucha, and I'm decked out in Lululemon sitting here right now. So I mean, I embrace that basicness of myself, but I think I'm still very curious, and I like to consider myself a lifelong learner. And I think in how it plays into the podcast, we talk about race quite a bit, and with people that want to talk about that. And I'm a firm believer that I'm a firm believer that race plays a role into your lived experience. It doesn't mean it's going to be the same for every brown person or every Chinese person. It just means it plays a role into your lived experience. And getting that representation in media, whether that's film or broadcasting or journalism, I think is very important. And people say, oh, it should be the best person for the job, but I don't even think the world works that way. It's not. Having, knowing from my own experience, I know that I've got spots that I did not deserve, and I know that I was denied spots that I did deserve. So, the world's a funny place. I don't think it's completely rational, and that's why I think things like racial representation are absolutely important. And you're never going to get a perfect formula for it, but just being aware of things like that, I think, is very important.
I never thought about booking guests who identified racially until very recently. About 10 years ago, I guess. What was David Mitchell? Remember David Mitchell, the Liberal MLA?
Yeah.
What was his wife's name?
Oh, gosh.
She worked for, Sherry Gordon. Was that her name?
Okay.
Yeah, she was a Sun columnist for a while, and she worked for Dosun. She was his press secretary. Okay. Anyway, she has this clearinghouse where you can get female pundits for on various subjects. And she made the point, and she made this to Steve Paikin on his show, that are the guests on his program reflective of gender? And Steve did a survey, and it was, I think, something like 70% male and 30% female. And he's since tried to improve that. And so about 10 years ago, I just looked at my roster at the time, and I saw that, it was mainly guys talking. And so if I'm going to have someone on to talk about a theater production or something like that, and the publicist suggests 2 or 3 people, I'll probably pick the woman. Mm-hmm. Because why not, right?
Yeah.
Or someone who is not white, if you will. I mean, I know that sounds terrible, but that's not what I was going for. But I mean, I think that you have to make the show a little more reflective, and I think that's my small part in doing that.
And I think it kind of goes to the original question when I asked you about the BC Poly Talk tweet is, what do we do in response to a concern, if you like, that we were being overrepresented. And on this very short 6 episodes that I've had only one woman on here, but I intend to interview a lot more women. And but I do think that there is almost an active need to try and respond to that by trying to. And to me, I don't kind of go in there. I haven't really taken these occasions to interview people so far to do any self-affirmation. I really just I hear some interesting, I have conversations with a number of these people before they come in, and then I get to learn more detail, and I guess we get to share that as well.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, paradoxically, and I'm not saying this to virtue signal or to make myself sound great or anything, I generally don't think about it. I have also, I think after 40 episodes or something, I did sort of do an inventory on racialized guests, but I was just booking guests that I was interested in. Yeah. And I think you do obviously want to be conscious about it, but you also don't want to have this ultra rational approach of trying to meet your own personal quotas.
Meet a quota, yeah. You don't want to do that.
So it is tough, in terms of being representative. But I think it's also just the idea of the more topics or the greater breadth of issues that you're trying to cover, the more open you're going to be, the more you're opening yourself up to having a diversity of guests. And that should hopefully bring on different racialized groups, different sexual orientation groups, whatever it may be.
I want to talk a little bit about the interviews that you either kind of wish you'd had or are planning to have. Did you ever get to interview Rafe Mayer?
Yeah, he was the most frequent guest on the show.
He's
He was
I'm
on
sorry
like
to say
11
that.
times, I think, or 10 or 11 times. Yeah.
Rafe was a complicated guy.
He
wasn't
was, yeah. But you got to know him, I guess, when, in the 90s?
Early 2000s.
Yeah, I got to know him near the end of his life. From the 2000s through the end of his life. And he was a fascinating person, obviously. An interesting person, but he was also, as you said, complicated.
I made the mistake. Rafe, I think I tried to teach him a few things around technology. I got him. I helped him build RafeOnline.com, and we put a bulletin board. And he had this loyal group of it was basically a very popular bulletin board software that we kind of wrapped around his site, and they would just be on there in these long, fantastic discussions. Some of them are still around. I see them on Twitter, but Rafe used to do these kind of bulk emails to his I guess his address book, and he got real bee in his bonnet among many issues around run of river, and I think even though I thought that the environmental side of run of river was sound, it turns out the economics were terrible. But he was really hot about the threats to the salmon population. So I made the mistake, in hindsight, of replying to Rafe one of his emails when he was ranting, and I just said, Rafe, because I was actually doing some work with the Ashley Creek project in the Squamish watershed, and I was quite convinced that they were on good ground there. I talked to the engineers, and so I said, Rafe, you maybe need to look at this a little differently, right? I kind of challenged, and he just ripped me. Like, I got this email where he was calling me every name with just F-bombs flying all over it. And it kind of soured my relationship. I didn't really ever kind of reconnect with Rafe at that point. I sent a note to Wendy when Rafe passed, but
I did a tribute show when Rafe died, just taking all the clips I'd had of him over the years and cutting them together. I talked to George Garrett and Sherelle Tobin, who was one of his closest producers, and she mentioned that he. Unfortunately, there were friendships over the years that because of politics or just personality even, went aside because Rafe wanted to be right about something.
Yeah. Mo, I know that you've got probably a long list of people you still want to talk to. Who's a couple of names that you're eager to get onto This Is VANCOLOUR?
So depending on when this is released and when you're listening to it, on January 27th, I have a true dream guest. The Canadian Newsmaker of the Year, Jody Wilson-Raybould, is on the program. We do almost an hour. I think it's about 50 minutes together. And it's, I go for the personal angle. I don't think that's really been asked of her in the media. And I was very happy with the interview. I thought it was magic. So I'm excited to put that out and excited to hear what people think of it. In terms of other dream guests, I was in touch with Jagmeet Singh's team throughout the federal election, and we couldn't get a date going. And I understand he obviously had a very busy schedule. That's someone on my list. The Premier, of course, I think would be a lot of fun. Erin Ireland, sort of the vegan entrepreneur, is one that I'm trying to. She just had a baby, so I figure she's quite busy, but I'm trying to get her on the program. The unicorn of all unicorns, for me personally, is Trevor Linden. And I don't want to talk about the management of the Canucks. I want to talk about his playing years and being a kid and watching him. And in a weird turn of events, many years ago, not many, 6 or 7 years ago, I ended up at an event and we were sitting at the same table. And listening to him talk about when he started his career, and guys would be smoking at intermission, and at the end of the game, they'd roll in a keg, to at the end of his career, there was, dozens of physical health and mental health experts between periods, helping everyone on every little thing for optimal performance, is a crazy time of that sport. And I think it's very reflective of our culture. So I would just love to sit down with him and chat with him about that. But I think he's kind of gone underground when it comes to media and being in the public spotlight. But if he ever resurfaces, I'm definitely going to try my hand at getting him on the program.
And he probably will, especially if he's got a business venture that he's going to launch. And it's almost guaranteed that's where he'll be going. He has the fitness centers, of course. And, but I'm sure the Canucks thing is something he wants to be able to take a little step back from that. And
for sure,
do a reboot. Yeah.
And to be honest, I don't really care about that stuff. I kind of stopped following the Canucks already at that point. So it's just a childhood dream guest in terms of someone I could really sit down and interview for an hour. That would be really cool.
Are there people for you, Mike? I hate to turn this into an interviewing Mike, but I mean, what else am I going to do? Are there people like that you'd like to have on? I mean, I just thinking of, for what I've done over the years, I mean, it's unbelievable sometimes when you have people on who you grew up listening to or reading.
Yeah.
And they're sitting in front of you or they're on the phone, and you can ask them anything you want to ask. I mean, you talked about J.B. Shane a moment ago. I mean, I can't wait to hear that because, here is a fan and someone who was a significant part of the sound of the city.
Yeah. Right now I'm not thinking of anything too much on the political side of things, although I'm also kind of disappointed here with what the Conservatives have done, because I think that they've become so careful and so cautious that they're not willing, and I get it, you're spending millions and millions of dollars on an election campaign, you can't afford for something to go slightly wrong.
Up, yeah.
But I think during a mandate, during a government mandate, I want to be able to get something where you're not just getting spun. I want to, and now with what's looking like almost a coronation for Peter MacKay, it'd be very interesting to see what MacKay has in mind in terms of, and as much of my work is focused around our Canadian urban centers and how, and I always feel like the political missing piece has always been, where is that, if you'd like, more kind of conservative thinking that could inform our local government, could inform policy, because I don't see it necessarily as being all about cuts and tax cuts. It's about being progressive and being smart with your money in the same time, and allowing us to kind of innovate and go in the right direction. And I'm not hearing that from anybody. I mean, you talked about the populist thing earlier on, Mo. I just don't see anybody coming up with any ideas. I'm just craving ideas right now so badly from our political leaders and our political class. And it's eventually push comes to shove something. And I just wrote about this in the Courier column. I said I was really frustrated, which I saw as status quo thinking coming out of Vancouver City Hall. And by that I meant is that there was a bunch of ideas that the Vision brought in, and it seems like they were kind of all sitting on those ideas instead of actually kind of taking them to the next place or even challenging and questioning them. And I like to think that it's important to challenge our institutions. And I sort of can sometimes almost get myself in trouble. But I was reflecting on and again, it's a sensitive time for the teachers right now because they're still in collective bargaining. But I said, is the structure that they're working in right now around the Teachers Federation absolutely the one that we need for the 21st century? We know that our education system is going through a lot of changes, the nature of not only teaching, but just the makeup of the composition of our classes. And so I asked those questions aloud, knowing full well that people are going to immediately assume that you're talking about, union busting or something like that. It's not. It's about asking, are the people, because we know that a lot of these institutions tend to be very, cronyistic, I mean, if you like. There's a lot of people that kind of come up just because they've been there for a long time, and so it's about bringing fresh ideas and new blood. And so I'm looking, if I can, to be able to talk to people who are looking at things a little differently. That's why I've had some of the interviews I've had, like with Arno Mattis, because Arno's always really impressed me on his different take on urban design. And then Alden Donnelly, who is one who has been asking some very hard questions about how we're going to address climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And she does it in a way that I think is different than others.
And you've had a column for a while now, and you've asked these questions in that column. You intend to ask these questions on a podcast. Do you think do you think it'd get you to the answers faster, say?
Isn't that because I've got people sitting in front of me? Potentially, yeah. I mean, if we can. I mean, the thing about the column is that a lot of the conversations I have, I mean, I'm doing reading and I'm having back channel conversations, but I generally don't quote people. I usually use a lot of people in background because but all of it is a learning process, I think for me, and I think for all of us. I think that's really kind of where we're all doing this. Yeah.
It doesn't end, does it?
No.
Guys, I think this has been a really fantastic hour and change for us right now. So, and I haven't done some of the things I typically do, which is kind of run for my music and because I thought the conversation really kind of went into a bunch of very interesting places. And I want to thank you both for coming out here. It was kind of not raining when we stared. Now it looks like it's kind of raining.
It's overcast, isn't it?
Yeah, it's Vancouver Overcast.
There we go. Yeah. Can I just say, I have to give a shout out to Planta here. He is an OG in this whole audio to internet medium.
For sure.
I think podcasting before it was called podcasting. So to be sitting here with him, it's truly an honor.
No, you're
Thanks for
kind,
having
and I
me.
appreciate the invitation, Mike, and it's good to see you both again.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So that's it for this episode of Vancouver Overcast. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks very much to Mo Amir. This is a VANCOLOUR podcast. Look it up. He's also on Twitter. Joseph Planta, TheCommentary.ca, and also at Planta on Twitter. So thanks very much, gentlemen. Look forward to us doing this again someday.